Thank you for having me here, and thank you for listening to me. And it's really amazing and wonderful when you have the president of your country supporting an educational forum like this, because the magnitude of what is going to be happening is beyond what I think most of us understand. And what I want to talk to you about is a whole different way of looking at everything. And that the way we understand medicine, the way we understand science and clinical trials and all of the things that are the box that we live in, what if all of that is wrong? And what I want to do is provide you with a scientific perspective based on physics, far from equilibrium thermodynamics, that allows us to understand life from a dynamic perspective rather than a static perspective. All of the compounds that you just heard Lumir discuss, there's easy ways to understand what their impact is on a biological system, because there is actually a simple kind of overview that can be utilized to understand what life is. And once we understand the physical basis of life, then a lot of things become obvious that are certainly not obvious and foundational to the way our world works. And unfortunately, our world is not working correctly. We are not promoting health, we promote money. And when you have healthcare systems that are driven by money rather than health, then there's a fundamental flaw in the system. And we see that in so many aspects of our society. And where I'm going to be going with this is that that represents the lack of cannabinoids in us because of our current level of evolution. And when you look at the evolutionary past, what you see is a constant increase in the cannabinoid activity in the brain and in the most evolutionarily advanced areas of the brain. Well, that tells you something important. And that's further amplified by the reality that psychoactive cannabinoids are in mother's milk. They're there for a reason. And if you don't understand how life works, then you don't understand those reasons. And when we see all of these compounds and we talk about their anti-cancer and anti-inflammatory and all of the different activities, unless you understand how the flow of life manifests in those things, then you don't understand what's going on. And it's really a very simple thing to understand what's going on. Hopefully I will communicate the beginnings of that. How long am I talking? 45 minutes or something? As much as I can. That'll take all day.
But Robert, please speak into the microphone.
Into the microphone. Okay.
Please.
All right, so...
Too fast.
Yes. Whoops, did I go the wrong way? Yes. All right, so what I want you to do is to just listen to what I'm saying. Don't try to stick it into the context of the world views that you have. Just listen to this, listen to the whole story, and then engage me. I want people to talk with me. And what I found is that the people who hear what I say and who are cannabis users, they right away understand that, yeah, this is obvious and simple. And yet when I talk to scientists and doctors, they can't even hear it. It just blows my mind. So hopefully in this country, that's less true than it is in the United States. The United States, the doctors are lock, stock, and barrel in a vision that's created by the pharmaceutical industries that is totally disconnected from what life is. So what I, again, want to start with is what is life? So we can... Yeah, the key concept that we're going to be talking about here is really how flowing energy organizes matter. And on the grandest scale, we're looking at how the spectrum of solar incidence, the sunlight that hits us, and the spectrum that hits us, how the informational potential, the organizational potential in those photons is captured to create organization and to drive organization. So that what I'm suggesting is that evolution will naturally increase in complexity as long as we have a source of energy to continuously create more and more organization. So we should look at the planet as one big chemical reaction that started when the planet started 4 billion years ago, and that chemical reaction has continuously gotten more complex because we've had a source to drive complexity. So I want to go into a little bit about the physics of how flow generates organization and how it manifests itself as life, and what I've really done for the past many years, decades now, is to try and understand the physics of life. When I back in the 60s, when the genetic code was first discovered, it was really nice. Now we understood that there were common mechanisms among all living things, and we could understand that there was this amazing process of DNA replication and transcription to make RNA and translation to make proteins, and then we just kept learning more and more and more and more about how much more complex it is than that. And what Prigogine did is he created a new field of physics. I was born in 1947, the year he got his PhD. And he got it in a field now known as far from equilibrium thermodynamics. The way we are taught in our schools and our society is based on equilibrium phenomena. And the rules and the possibilities of equilibrium phenomena are entirely different than the rules for flow-dependent phenomena. In fact, at equilibrium, there is no time. And we live in a world of time, and we live in a world where time does not go backwards and forwards, which is how the foundations of the physics that we're taught teaches us, because there are aspects where there's a truth to that. But when you look at the universe that we live in, when you look at your lives, are you going backwards? Are you getting older? Or are you getting younger? You know, what's going on in our society? All of these things have a fundamental scientific basis that was provided, understanding of which, through the work of Ilya Prigogine. He got the Nobel Prize in 1977 for the concepts of dissipative structures, flow-dependent structures. We are flow-dependent structures. Cut off the flow of what sustains us and the removal of our wastes, we die. It's that simple, because we are flow-dependent structures. And I want to give you some insights now into what that really means so that we start to appreciate dynamics as opposed to statics. I think what I have. Yeah, so life is a dynamic fractal. Everybody know, I hope, what a fractal is? You know, it's a mathematical algorithm that gives you a picture. And when you reiterate that algorithm, it expands that picture, and you see inside the same thing again. And you can keep going in, or you can keep going out, and you keep generating the same picture, okay? Well, that's a static fractal. And what I'm suggesting life is a dynamic fractal, one that adapts constantly. Every time the algorithm is made, the algorithm interacts with the environment, and that changes the nature of what's needed next. And the algorithm changes. That's what life is, the constant adaptation, okay? So we are, and our whole unfolding biochemistry is a dynamic fractal. So let's look at some of the qualities, of dynamics. We were going into this already. Those are pictures of fractals. So here, I want to go into some really amazing, interesting information. It's estimated that we have 50 billion tons of DNA on the planet. Now, DNA is a complex molecule. It doesn't form randomly. It forms because life is a natural process that naturally occurs from flowing energy and keeps replicating itself and increasing its adaptability as it changes its environment. That's what's happening not only with us on the macro scale, but that's what happens within us, within our cells. And that's where we're going to ultimately go to see how cannabis touches the very soul of our being in how it manipulates metabolism, because it's metabolism from which life emerges. What I'm suggesting here is that flow-dependent structures occurred in the in the inorganic prebiotic soup. We had increased inorganic complexity. It reached a critical point, and we had what's called a far from equilibrium phase change. And that phase change created life. And that all subsequent evolution and the generation of all species has to be viewed as simply phase changes in the chemistry of the existing distribution within the chemistry of the planet. We're all part of a big ongoing chemistry set. We rob information out of sunlight, and that powers the creation of time. And where I'm going with this from a biological point of view is that we're stuck thinking the wrong way in so many examples. For example, chronological age. Chronological age for a living organism, especially a sentient living organism, is not how old you are based on the ticking of the clock. It's how far you are from equilibrium. How much complexity is maintained in the flowing structure that you are. And that's what we're going to go into, how that plays as the basis of life. But let's go back to DNA here. So 50 billion tons of this highly improbable molecule. Why? Because it is a highly probable molecule when it comes to flow and creation. Not when you say, oh, what's the probability if I flip, all of these atoms and I'm going to generate that molecule? That's the static view. The probability is zero. We could never be here from a standard statistical perspective. But that's not what happens when you look at this other form of stuff. So every day, a person makes approximately their weight in ATP. And ATP is the fundamental energy currency. It's like the dollar bill in the financial world, okay? It's how we do things. So we need ATP, but imagine we make our body weight every day. You don't notice that you're making your body's weight in that. You make it, you break it, you make it, you break it. And what we want to talk about now is how you make that ATP. Because depending on what your energy source is, meaning carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, it has totally different consequences in terms of how the energy flows and the nature of the pathways that are being utilized and how much and to what extent a cell, for example, is communicating with its environment. And it's the same thing with us. Are we too angry to communicate, or are we loving and communicating? It's all part of the same expression of the same energy pyramiding over the time that's created by moving the system further from equilibrium. All right, so every cell has about 2 yards of DNA in it. Now imagine replication. 2 yards in something so small you can't even see it, okay? And where I want to go now is that one single free radical molecule, one single molecule, one time, hitting one base in a critical gene in a DNA of one cell that was not prevented by the antioxidant activity of the cell, was fostered by the metabolic state of the cell, caused an alteration in the DNA that was not seen by the DNA repair mechanisms, created a change that became a genetic change that was not recognized by the immune system, and a cancer grew. And that was not treated by chemotherapy successfully, and it was too late for cannabis, and you died. One molecule can kill you, especially because when you're looking at dynamics, you're looking at how the flow amplifies. So you're seeing an inappropriate state amplifying and taking over the organism, okay? And the organism ultimately, therefore, goes back to equilibrium. Back to equilibrium is death, okay? Phase change. All right. So how does that happen? And what goes on? And how do we protect ourselves when the DNA is unraveled and naked? Because you got that 2 yards of DNA coming out of its shell, so to speak. It's normally wrapped up with proteins called histones, and that's protective. But when you're replicating, it's all single-stranded to parts, and there's proteins, etc., but it's a different deal, and they're very susceptible. Well, it turns out that, for us to thrive in terms of continued growth, we need to make energy efficiently, same as in society, right? You don't want to pollute yourself to death, but you want to make energy as efficiently as you can. And for that, we use what's called the electron transport system. But the electron transport system is very dangerous because it makes free radicals. And one single molecule can kill you. And what I didn't tell you is that every one of us has approximately 15 trillion cells. And that every day, every one of those cells sustains approximately 20,000 of the damages where one damage in one cell, one time can kill you. Think of that. That's insanity, right? What that should tell you is something very important, and it's the basis of why I want you to listen to what I'm saying. Because what that tells you is that we have to have a tremendous amount of the organization of cells and how cells interact and how we form the complexity of life has to be devoted to managing all of those free radicals we make when we're making that ATP equivalent to our body's weight every day. All right? And where approximately, I think it's 4% or 0.4, I don't remember the number, I think it's 4% of the electrons from the electron transport system leak, so to speak, as free radicals. So you're talking about every day making enough to kill you, and we're not dying, we're here. The question is, what can we do to improve our health? How can we understand this better? What are the manifestations of taking this kind of perspective? So, more about the insanity here. Every one of us, if you took the DNA from us and stretched it out, it would go from here to the sun and back 400 times. I mean, this is just lunacy, right? So we have to protect our DNA because we know a single molecule can kill us and we're receiving all those damages. How do we protect our DNA? We protect our DNA by changing the metabolism that we use at different stages in the cycle of the cell. So cells go through what's called the cell cycle, and part of that is what's called G1. When in that phase, they're building all of the resources that they need because the cell has to either go do something or it has to divide. But if we're talking about cycle, we're talking about division, okay? So what has to happen is we have to be able to have a safe zone where all that DNA can be unwrapped. So we want to basically turn off the electron transport system at that time. And what cells do is they do that. They turn off the electron transport system and they generate energy in a different way, an inefficient way. They use what's called aerobic glycolysis. They burn sugar via what would be a fermentation pathway. It's how you make alcohol, right? So normally we don't make lactic acid in the presence of oxygen. We do it if we're, say, working out and running out of oxygen, and then you utilize other pathways. But when you're breathing normal and cells provided with oxygen, it wouldn't do that. And what I'm suggesting is cells have to do that in order to prevent the free radicals from killing them when they're naked, when the DNA is unraveled. And now think about what's the big characteristic that's been known since 1928 when Otto Wahlberg first described it. It's called the Wahlberg Effect. It's aerobic glycolysis that characterizes cancer cells. Well, what I'm suggesting is that, and we'll go into this, but a totally radical way of looking at, totally the opposite of what we accept as reality. Normally reality from a genetic point of view, and I'm trained very classically, but I no longer believe anything that I used to believe. So what I'm suggesting is that the metabolism is constantly adapting to the environment, and that in doing that, it's able to utilize different states of energy production, like when the cells are replicating, and that if you had a cancer cell, what it has to intrinsically do is use some adaptive mechanism because it's got an imbalance in its biochemical flow. And whenever you have an imbalance, by one means or another, you will wind up generating free radicals. And free radicals are responsible for killing cells, whether it be by a more peaceful apoptotic mechanism where the cell kind of unwraps itself slowly and can be eaten up easily, or whether the cell blows up and all of those things that are in there that are part of normal flow-dependent communication are now blown out. So that's highly inflammatory, and that would be a more of a necrotic type of cell death. Anyway, So where was I? I get lost easily. So Prigogine, you know, we've already talked about him, a term that he liked, a concept, was the more deeply we study nature of time, the better we understand that duration means invention, creation of forms, continuous elaboration of the absolutely new. What I'm trying to suggest is that as our cells adapt to the metabolism, we will then predispose that metabolic state to be genetically modified so that that saving state now becomes genetic. In other words, instead of going from mutations to genetics, I'm saying to metabolism, what I'm saying is we go from metabolism to genetics. And I'll elaborate that on that a little bit more. But what that means is our metabolism adapts to our environment, and then to give us an opportunity to perpetuate that, we then have the ability to, and the natural ability by virtue of free radical damages, et cetera, at the sites of transcription that are providing surviving genes, that we can then, you know, utilize all of these things in different ways. So invention, constantly creating, that's what our cells are constantly doing, and constantly adapting. And adaptation occurred with the evolution of the vertebrates at a whole new level. And what went along with that was the development of the CB1 receptor. It first appeared with vertebrates. And what is the CB1 receptor, which is the #1 neurotransmitter system in your brain? What is it doing? It's protecting against free radicals. And it does it in a number of ways by modulating, in particular, calcium channels. Calcium is always involved in activation of everything. If you're looking at a muscle contraction, a neurotransmission, the production of insulin, calcium activation, relationships with mitochondria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a million details here, but it's all under the same umbrella concepts. You see, when you're ADD like I am, then you can't become a reductionist because you can't focus long enough to go down. So you keep jumping, and eventually you get a big overview. And that's why I can see what I've seen, because I'm basically incapable of not seeing it and looking the other way. Anyway, what we have to do is embrace this idea of constant unfolding of time as what drives our adaptive metabolism, and that in turn becomes our genetics, and the fundamental role that the CB1 and the CB2 receptor have played in that, because the CB1 receptor, by modulating essentially the electron transport system. You know, there are new studies that show that actually you have CB1 receptors on mitochondria. So that relationship hasn't been appropriately or in detail enough yet established that I know of or defined. But nevertheless, the point here is the CB1 receptor promotes the differentiated state that requires efficient energy production. And what it does is it fine-tunes that electron transport energy production so that the brain was able to stay in that mode longer without making too many free radicals and killing itself. So the whole evolution of our brain, from my perspective, is that we had that CB1 receptor fine-tuning free radical production via retrograde transmission and modulation of calcium and blah, blah, other channels as well. So where we're going to go with this is that the CB2 receptor modulates fat burning, which is equivalent to autophagy, which is equivalent to recycling. And if you think about society, if all you do is build and waste and dirt and corruption, then you can't breathe your air anymore, like in China, okay? You have to have a balance between growth, degradation, repair, and replacement. And that's what happens when we turn on fat burning. Beta oxidation is cellular recycling. And what is it recycling? It's recycling the damage that was done when you were making energy efficiently with the electron transport system. So if all of this swirls in harmony, you're healthy, and if not, you got some illness. And then the question becomes, how do we redirect the flow to promote a state of health? And that's what cannabis naturally does, because it works both sides of the fence here. It turns on fat burning, it turns on carbohydrate metabolism, and most cancers start out as sugar burners, because what you did when you came in with chemo to an imbalanced cell that was already struggling to survive free radical production, inflammation, blah, 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 it had some metabolic pathway that it took, that it amplified, that allowed it to escape. So, for example, you have 1 million cells, and some of them are dividing, and some of them are in S phase, and you come in with your chemo, what are you going to do? You're going to kill all the cells except for the ones that were in the metabolic state that allowed them to live. And they then will be having the genes that allowed for survival unwound. And because they're already imbalanced, they're making extra free radicals. If you just stall a transcription fork, that will already promote strand breaks. Strand breaks promote recombinational events, duplication events, all of the things that drive evolution. So what I'm telling you, and this is total radical but total sensible to me at this point, is that we drive mutagenesis to solve the problem of how do we institutionalize survival in the current environment. And we see this in epigenetics as well, because it's the epigenetics that allow for the transfer between between generations. And this whole approach solves a lot of real simple things to look at. For example, the balance between fat burning and sugar burning being so critical. Well, when that sperm is wiggling its way, because remember, your endocannabinoid system regulates everything in your body from conception until death. Everything. And what we are is a collection of molecules that have two fundamental interfaces with the environment. Our nervous system monitors all information that comes into the system via our senses. And our immune system monitors all mass that comes into the system. And our nervous system, because of the complexity, needs to stay in that sugar-burning mode. And that's why it's so susceptible to damage. And our CB2 receptors, in turn, allow for our immune cells, when they're cranking out and therefore generating free radicals, to kind of go back and forth with the fat burning a little more so they don't kill themselves with too many free radicals when they're cranking out, say, tons of antibodies or activating T-cell receptors, or et cetera. So cannabis modulates what comes into us and promotes a more harmonious adaptation. Cannabis, evolutionarily, is an adaptogen. And what we are evolutionary probes in the biochemistry set of the planet. And we are designed as evolutionary probes to survive, to find the ones that can survive, just the way the cancer cell was selected, okay? But we don't want to be cancer cells. We want to be cells that function in harmony together, which is the basis of life. Unfortunately, humanity has taken a little turn to the wrong side because our societies and our governments and our institutions are driven by cannabinoid deficient people. I call them blips, backward-looking people. Because what they are doing is trying to institutionalize everything, make rules for everything so that we can all follow the rules, and then everything will be perfect. Because they don't understand that is exactly the opposite of the way life works. So anyway, back to Prigogine here. We are actually the children of the arrow of time, of evolution, not as progenitors. Quantum theory says that something only becomes real when you make a measurement. Well, that would mean that we are making our universe. This is bullshit. We are the children, the natural part of the unfolding of the complexity driven by flowing energy. So here are some examples. This is what's called a Bernard instability. You're looking at a Petri dish, and what you see when it's magnified is that you have these hexagonal convection cells. The Petri dish is heated from below, and hot molecules have formed those hexagons naturally and carry the heat up to the atmosphere above where they lose the heat, and then the cool molecules funnel through the center. It's like a little organized bucket brigade. This is impossible to happen from standard way of thinking. It's too improbable. You don't have 10 to the 20 molecules cooperating, and yet you can do this time and time again. Flowing energy organizes matter because the dissipation of potential occurs at greater rate. In other words, we rob more informational potential out of the sunlight to power our organization than would occur if we weren't here. So life has to be driven by potential, just like these structures are driven by potential. And what we have here is a similar phenomena, again in a Petri dish. It's called the Bellows-Zhabotinsky reaction. I always forget which one's which, but back in the 50s, one of them discovered this reaction. And what it shows you, again, is that in a liquid, we have organization occurring. However, in this case, what's being measured is what's known as the redox potential, the distribution basically of electrons between molecules. Some that have them, some that don't, some that want them, some that don't, and that creates the potential for flow, redox. That's how we live. We breathe oxygen, we burn our hydrocarbons, we spit out our CO2, and we make our energy, either efficiently or inefficiently, sorry. So here we're seeing an indicator that shows the redox. And originally this was fully random. And you put together these chemicals and then spontaneously order forms. So this is what I'm saying happened in the primordial soup, driven by sunlight, driven by thermal energy, all sorts of, we generated molecular complexity. Here's an example where I just do it in a test tube, because now it's more three-dimensional, and an important thing that I want to bring up comes out as a result of that. So we all agree that the molecules are fully random, right? And the same redox indicator, ferroin, is in there, so it'll turn blue as this reaction occurs. And you'll see it turn blue on the bottom and then move on up the tube, like there. And it'll continue to do that as long as potential is there, as long as the so-called sunlight is shining, as long as the chemical potential can create flow. And you'll see it come and go. So why is this important? It shows you how flowing energy creates structure both in time and in space. Because that's all we are these pulsating hypercycles of organized energy. We wake up, we go to sleep. Our heart beats, it contracts, it relaxes. We breathe in, we breathe out. We have menstrual cycles. All of these things are natural harmonies and flows that result from flow-dependent biochemistry. All right, what do we got next? So, any of us who are biologists, we always see a metabolic map. Well, the problem with the metabolic map is it is static. And every one of those junctions, every one of everything that you see there has an enzyme that's allowing a reaction to occur at our body temperature that otherwise would not occur. So we've created information channels via the proteins that are the enzymes that we make, that come from the DNA that we manipulate in response to our environment, so that we can adapt, because we have CB1 receptors that let us do that better. That's why most of your brain's energy comes from sugar. And that's why it's so damageable, because it doesn't have room for any more free radicals, because it's already doing everything it can to be as organized as it can. And we see that. Feel your head and your neck. It's hot. And that's making energy efficiently. You couldn't do it inefficiently. That's why we need the cannabinoid receptor to survive. And right now, the purpose of this conference, unbeknownst to us, is that we're simple tools in this flowing biochemistry. We are organizational entities that are spreading a piece of knowledge that, because it is true, will naturally permeate. That's why we're seeing around the world the global awakening, the cannabis awakening. It's happening not because somebody's advertising it, not because somebody's making money, even people are making money, because it's real, it's true, and we want to share with our friends, our family, and our community. So anyway, this is a static dead map. There's an enzyme at every one of those places. Those enzymes are regulated at the post-translational level. They're regulated allosterically. They're regulated at the transcriptional level, translational level. They're regulated by the architecture, all of these things. None of that is captured there. This is minus life, and this is how we teach. This is how we regulate, how we create our pharmaceutical industry, all based on the wrong stuff. Or I'm crazy. Maybe I'm crazy. So, we have to bring it to life. Bring it to life means flow. And life, we can have directional harmony. You see, there's something very special going on, and this is what's leading us. We are actually now involved in the very process that I'm telling you about, because we are increasing the cannabinoid activity of ourselves, of our families, of our communities. That's creating a genetic expression environment, an epigenetic phenomena that will be transmitted to our offspring. Instead of being brought up as a result of, say, alcoholic parents who are stressed and insane, or parents suffering from PTSD because they went in the military and then got forced onto narcotics and antidepressants so they could kill themselves. Meanwhile, they're having children, and the epigenetic patterns are predisposing them to the wrong things. And you combine that with the ultimate, one of the ultimate, a few of them, they're so absurd, sugar-free diets. That is just lunacy, because that means you're only burning carbohydrates. That's promoting all of the age-related illnesses that are all caused by free radicals, including cancer and autism and all of the crap that is abundant. We are promoting that with government official approval. You know, don't make fat. You know, the fat that clogs your artery, guess what? You make it out of sugar. And why do you make it out of sugar? Because your cells are saying to you, and you're too stupid to listen, you're killing me with too many carbohydrates. And as a consequence, I'm making too many free radicals, and I don't want to eat any more of your sugar. What is that? Diabetes, okay? And what happens before or after, doesn't matter. Your cells, your body's trying to protect you. So what it does is it takes, again, protect you from too many free radicals. So instead of burning all of those carbs, let's store them as fat. And that way they're out of the way, except all of that fat is still in a pro-inflammatory generator of free radicals. So as long as we maintain ourselves in a pro-inflammatory metabolic state, all we're doing is wrapping up the stuff that would be protecting us, fat burning, caloric restriction, all of these things that make life. And, you know, I speak from a personal point of view on this. I'm going to be 70 years old. I've used cannabis for 53 years. I have a lot of genetic predispositions, arthritis and gout and all, you know, spinal deterioration. I'm 2 inches shorter than I used to be. Most of the time, I feel fine. But I wake up in the morning and I take cannabis oil. And then I take hemp oil. And I take a whole spectrum of nutraceuticals that turn on fat burning. And then I'll have my breakfast, which might be some nice, almost no carbohydrate granola with berries, etc., with heavy cream. All of the things that we are told not to do is wrong. And part of that is because we're burning, you know, instead of having milk from cows that are fed grass, which then they make high omega-3s. You know, every doctor tells you omega-3s are good for you, right? Fish oil, etc. What does your body do with fish oil, with these omega-3s? It makes cannabinoids out of them. The reason fish oil is good for your heart is because it's making pot. And your heart, unlike your brain, doesn't want to die too quickly. It's, you know, it can get away without it. It's a lot easier to describe an algorithm of your heart than your brain, okay? So what happens is your heart burns fat a lot of the time, because that way it's not killing itself and aging as much, unless you force it to by not giving it any of the right fats, all right? So then you're giving it all the sugar, and those, you know, you have your macrophages that are penetrating inflammatory zones in your blood vessels, and as they get out of the blood vessel and into the musculature, etc., they turn into what's called foam cells. They're foam cells because they're full of fat, because they're trying not to die, and they're making all that fat instead of burning it all. And then some of them die or get stuck out there, and that turns into your plaque. So thank your doctors and your governments for telling you to eat fat-free diets to protect your heart. They are responsible for your problems. We have people using cannabis routinely who are getting rid of their clogged arteries, who are getting off their insulin. This whole pharmaceutical industry and all this double-blind FDA nonsense is bullshit, because they are testing poisons. Poisons that are not part of the living system. They don't have the synthetic pathways. They don't have the degradative pathways. They're looking for one observation. Can I block this little thing here? And what's going to happen? Well, if you're dealing with a differentiated cell that's burning sugar, it spends its life talking to the environment. That's how we get to be who we are, and that's how we become who we can be socially, by talking and by communicating effectively. But if your cells can't do that properly, then things get scrambled, the messages get messed up, and cells start doing things like making fibers to survive, making fats to survive, replicating to survive. These are all escape mechanisms because you are forcing them into the wrong environment. You are what you eat. And if you're going to insist on not recycling enough, and building too much in the wrong way, or not building, but still the wrong way, you know, just getting fatter, for example, that tells you something is wrong with your biochemistry, and your cells are trying to inform you that you got to do something different. And what I'm telling you is this stuff works. Diabetics who stop using insulin, losing 60, 80 pounds, you know, in a year. The medical marijuana community is where the real information is. What's going on in the scientific community is wonderful in that it explains on a fine level what's going on. But if you don't put it together in this story that I'm providing you with, and you don't understand that they're doing all the wrong things because they're not addressing the heart of it. When we take high doses of cannabis, and you give them to a cancer patient, if those cancer cells are sugar burners, which they're likely to be because of the things I've already described to you, and we already know that, okay? You give them high CBD, high THC, turn on the CB2 receptor, and that turns on fat burning. And if the cells can't make that metabolic shift because they're already stressed just to survive their imbalances in the sugar burning mode, if they can't make that, they die. And that's why cannabis cures so many cancers. And it doesn't matter what cancer, because all of the things that I'm telling you are true of all of the cancers. Because all of the things that I'm saying from my understanding. And I can't engage scientists because they won't even listen to this. I went down this path with one guy recently. He had some interesting metabolic studies. And as soon as I brought up pot, after 15 minutes, he told me to get up and leave his office because his wife is a doctor. It's like, what the hell is going on here? You know, and along these lines, in terms of how our society has become an impressive insanity. You know, I've been an expert witness in many trials, both in the United States and Canada, in many states, and on many levels. And a friend was recently arrested, and I wasn't allowed to be an expert witness because I don't have a favorable attitude towards law enforcement, as that has anything to do with the science. And then I wasn't allowed to be a personal witness because they don't want me in the courtrooms. And then I went to the courtroom anyway, and after sitting there, eventually the lawyers were called to the bench, and who is that guy sitting behind you, blah, blah, blah. Tell him if he continues smiling, he's going to be held in contempt of court and go face 6 months of jail. This is America, you know? So I stood up, looked at all the jurors, smiled, and left. But, it's this kind of insanity that permeates our society. They are entrenched. It's the blips, I call them, the backward-looking people. The cavemen of the world are the ones who are ruling the world. And they are the oppressors. The meek shall inherit the earth. Well, who's the meek? The meek are the cannabinoid-endowed people who said, oh, you want to throw me in jail? Oh, only for 20 years? Thank you for not giving me life. Fuck you. You know, that's the bottom line. This is just a lot of shit. I've lost all tolerance, you know, in case you can't tell. So we've been going over all this free radical stuff. We've gone over this metabolic stuff, you know. If we pump too much in, we spit out too many free radicals, and we have problems. So you either got to pump in less, caloric restriction, burn more fat, or you've got to, you know, exercise more so that you can use what you're taking in. And when you exercise more, what you're doing is you're creating a higher level of organization, negative entropy, moving yourself further from equilibrium, health. Okay? You can move yourself further from equilibrium by laying in bed and eating all day, because if we burned you, there would be more calories coming out. But those are not the calories I'm talking about. Those are not the ones that are bringing you further from equilibrium in an informational way, which is what evolution is all about. So we can either become part of the future by embracing the ideas of what life is, or we can ignore basically the will of God, generalized open system dynamics, God, for me, science, as we learn to be honest and to unfold new things. We'll just jump through all of this. So I've already talked about metabolic plasticity. That's so important because all we're doing is selecting from metabolic states when we come in with these weird drugs that are not part of our flow. The difference between CB1 and CB2. The difference between CB1 and CB2, recycling versus building. We have to be in balance with that. The same as in society. Oh, I didn't talk about this. This is very important. Because if I'm right here, this is how we embrace the adaptability, okay? Your stem cells are fat burners. Because if they're burning fat, they're not aging. Because they're not making free radicals. Free radicals are what causes aging, okay? But if they're going to become something, then they have to turn on the electron transport system so they can make energy efficiently so they can do something. And the CB1 receptor, it does that. So whether you're looking at, neurogenesis, which is regulated by your CB1 receptor, that's the differentiation of neurons and the rewiring and plasticity. But in order to do that most effectively, you want to first expand, those stem cells. What happened here? You want to expand those stem cells with symmetric division. So the right balance between CB2 promoting fat burning and the other things that are going to allow for the expansion of our stem cells and then the replacement of our damaged tissues and areas. I'm experiencing these things in myself. With the things that I tell you, I am doing on myself, and I've been doing on myself for years. I wish I knew what I know now 20, 40 years ago. I'm teaching it to my children, I can tell you that. And these things work. We can fix ourselves if we give ourselves an opportunity. And if we don't understand how we work, and if we go and we take our pharmaceuticals because they're going to relieve some symptom until they cause some side effect that may kill you, it's all insanity. I'll give you an example. I'm very ADHD. I'm really mentally ill, okay? I can't read a sentence half the time. And what cannabis did was it showed me what an idiot I was. So at least I now had a focal point, of how to fix the problem. But my son is the same way, and maybe it's because both of us have had head injuries. One of my theories is that the crazy of us are the ones who've had head injuries because then we make a lot of anandamide and we rewire. And that gives us, like evolutionary taste again. Anyway, that's a separate issue here. Anyway, my son is so ADHD, and my ex really wanted to save him because she knows how insane I am, and I only survived by good luck. I'm just very lucky to understand and know what I do. Anyway, poor Luke was struggling, and we put him on some Ritalin. And within 3 days, he could breathe. We got him off the Ritalin. And then we put him on Adderall, and that was great for about 2 weeks until he had personality changes, and he really became an obnoxious asshole. And just at that time, I read an article about how CBD is more effective than these drugs. And I said, look, and I happen to have thousands of these CBD pills because I eat these, in addition to all the THC, I eat a lot of these specially prepared CBD extracts that have blown my mind in terms of healing potential. So the combination is amazing. Anyway, Luke gets on these. He's fine. He's doing good in school. He's happy. It works. Again, all of these increased cannabinoid activity is how we got here. And that's how we will get to where we're going because that's the way it's always worked. Our governments are fundamentally against life. It's that simple. Anyway, I must be out of time, right? You tell me when to shut up. All right. So chemotherapy, we've already mentioned, just is going to select for the metabolic state, which will then become the genetics. That's why every breast cancer has 50 different mutations in it. Because you generated those mutations, you selected for them by all the surviving metabolic states. Focused mutagenesis. We've already talked about evolution of the brain. That's the problem right there. And then that's where we have to go. Now, I didn't show you any cancer pictures, but I can show you some really interesting cancer pictures. And how many people here are like real biologists, scientific doctors, etc.? All right, a few. Let me show you some pictures. Zimmer's group years ago, because they isolated a CB1 knockout. So these mice are like the government's dream. They can't get high at all. That's what they try to impose on us, even though nature has selected for the CB1 receptor to always be active anyway, right? So you see, if you have a CB1 double knockout, they die a lot earlier than if you've got a functional CB1 gene. So why is the government trying to kill us and preventing us from using something that can up that level? Because we're all different. We are all different. We're like, you know, you take two twins. You think they have the same biochemistry? You think that they have the same hallucinations? Nonsense. They're all totally different in terms of the flow of their biochemistry. And you can select for different things. In any event, clearly, we need cannabis activity, CB1 receptor activity to live, period. And free radicals are the friction of life. If you make too many of them, you age quicker. You don't think, see, that's the important thing. People think of free radicals in terms of antioxidants, things like vitamin C, for example. But most of the free radicals we generate metabolically. And by controlling metabolism, you inhibit free radicals. So when you see this term, antioxidant activity inhibits free radicals, is it a direct antioxidant or is it a metabolic manipulator? All that I've seen of the different Chinese medicines, of all of these different extra goodies that are in cannabis that Lemire showed us earlier, you'll find all of them turn on fat burning. That's why they're good for you. That's why they have all these health-promoting properties. They're turning on recycling for you. The easy way to monitor what's going on is look whether something is either activating mTOR, which is an energy-utilizing pathway that's involved in cell division and differentiation and blah, 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 or whether it's activating AMP kinase. When you have too much AMP, which indicates low energy, that means something was wrong, and that's when you turn on AMP kinase, and that's when you turn on all of this recycling. So AMP kinase equals recycling, mTOR equals differentiation. And it's that simple. All you got to do is look where the different chemicals go. You know, what they activate or they don't activate, and then start to understanding the different metabolic pathways that can be regulated for these different outcomes. You know, for example, how many of you have heard of acetylcholine? Almost none, okay? If you take too much THC, most people will not have a pleasant experience, especially if you're taking pure THC. It's horrible. You know, I love to get stoned. I've been stoned my whole life. I would not get stoned using THC. It sucks. I tried it twice. Marinol, forget it. It's retarded, all right? Where was I going with this? As my oil kicks in even further. Speaking, all right, so we'll continue with this. Hemp seeds, in the village in China, they eat hemp seeds, one of their mainstays. And these are not FDA approved, GMO, blah, 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 free of THC. Of course, there's some THC there. They're eating all these omega-3s. Although omega-3s in seed oils are not as good as fish oils because they're the short ones. And human breast milk is loaded with the EPA and DHA converts to endoethanolamine derivative cannabinoids that Lemire showed you some pictures of. So it's in breast milk. Think about that, you know? Why? Because it protects the brain. The kid's head got squished, 20 hours of labor that first time especially, you know? Lack of oxygen, all of those things, you need to protect it. So you give it the breast milk, first thing that comes out. Get the kid stoned, relax the kid, fix the kid's brain up a little. It works perfectly. If you don't do it, like in some of these mice that you can make the knockout mice, or you can use a CB1 antagonist, you know, like rimonabant, the newborn babies, they die. They fail to thrive. They're not interested in eating. We need cannabinoids. It's the simplest, easiest thing. This woman died a couple of years later. I'm 120, but my joints are okay, all right? You shouldn't have smoked. You would have lived longer. You know, I mean, come on. let's see what else. I want to get to these cancer pictures. Well, this was some of the early ones. This one came out of Spain from Guzman's lab, and what they showed you here, whoops, was that if you had no cancer cells introduced, nobody died. If you had cancer cells, they died. If you gave a synthetic or THC, they lived. They injected THC right into the brain, and you saw that there was no damage to anything other than the cancers. So this was real important because this started to wake people up again. But keep in mind, anti-cancer activity was shown, I think, in 1972, and then it disappeared. Now, how could any competent government not jump on the fact that they found a plant that cures cancer, or that indicates that it can cure cancer, especially when you look at the history? Because historically, everything that we now know was already implemented. We didn't know the biochemistry, which is wonderful to know, but people were taking care of themselves in the past and knowing the same things that we now see. And that's why the medical marijuana community is, a decade ahead of the medical community, because they're still trying to think of what dose should we give? How many times a day? That is just horse shit. You take as much as makes you feel better, and then you try a different strain and you feel better or worse. That's what cures illness. That's what helps people. And we've seen it with hundreds and thousands of people. It works. We've seen people out of wheelchairs get up and walk. I'll show you some cancer pictures now. So this is a dear friend of mine, Jacqueline. She had basal cell up there. We put tar on it, the extract, and within a few weeks, totally gone. And she's had many now because she grew up on a farm, on a sugarcane farm in Australia. You had, fair-skinned limeys going to the equator saying, please give me cancer. And, of course, nature obliges. You do the wrong things, you suffer. Anyway, doctor's note. So here, she had cured herself so many times that, you don't care anymore, right? But squamous cell cancers behave differently. So here, you see she had like a little dot up there on her nose, and she puts on the tar, and instead of kind of drying up and shriveling up, it starts to grow, and it grows. And I am freaking out, because this was like 2 months. And this is an attractive woman. I couldn't believe she had the courage to be walking around with that nose and going to work and doing things. So I'm thinking, shit, what if I'm wrong, So I said, I can't stand it anymore, Jackie. Take some hydrogen peroxide, put it on a tissue, because that'll generate extra free radicals, because that's how we control everything, right? We need to overload these cells so that the solution of replication is no longer viable. We overload them, and the only solution then is not apoptosis, it's necrosis. They just, okay? And that's exactly what happened. We put on, within an hour, you can see how it went from being swollen to starting to shrivel. And then it just progressively, fell off, rotted away, literally, and heals. That's the thing that blows your mind, is how it heals without a scar. And we've seen that with Kaposi's sarcoma. You can completely control HIV with cannabis, because so many viruses, they have evolved in that sugar-burning differentiated state. All of their metabolic pathways are dependent on that. So that's not true of all viruses. Some have a more complicated situation. But HIV and herpes viruses like that, which causes Kaposi's, are totally regulated. Turn on fat burning. Use a lot high doses of cannabis, and you can go from having millions of HIV viruses to undetectable. You can get rid of the hump on your back and your belly. You can restore your T-cell count just by using a lot of oil. Over years now, we've seen it. So these are just, again, examples of how we can modulate metabolism, and how metabolism is the basis of everything. And whether we're dealing with infections or autoimmune diseases or cancers, they have a metabolic signature that is going to be unique for all of us, because we are all completely unique. You go and do an experiment. You have 50 mice that are genetically identical, and you inject them with something and you look for some outcome. You think they all do the same thing? Of course not. But they were genetically identical, because that's not what's important. It's the metabolic flow that's important. All right. These are the ones that I wanted to show you. I have one really gross one I can show you, too. Well, this was another squamous cell on the arm. You see how after the oil came on, it grew out? At that time, I thought it was kind of like the cancer actually coming out. It's growing. It's growing. It's not coming out. But that one also disappeared. And even what you see here, that is not, you can't even see anything anymore. And now this was a real tragic story here. When he came to me, and again, I have PTSD, so I cry very easily, and he became my friend. He contacted me and he says, Bob, you have to help me. So he went to the doctor. He had the worst case of squamous cell carcinoma they ever saw. He was, 2 inches above the top of his head. Those holes went all the way in. They filled with fluid. It was disgusting, okay? And he goes to one doctor. He says, oh, we can take care of that. We'll just cut off your scalp, and then we'll treat your skull. We'll cut your skull off, and we'll mount it under your skin, and we'll treat it for a year, and then we'll put it back, and then we'll skin graft you. He said, no, that ain't happening, all right? And he goes to another doctor, a radiation oncologist. He says, oh, no problem. This was the man's head after 130 irradiations. Now, how can the medical establishment do something like that? It's all about making money. Anyway, what you did was, you see you got one there, and there's another one on top you can't really see. He basically selected for 3 drug-resistant tumors. When you have the drug-resistant tumors, fully drug-resistant tumors, they know how to shift metabolically. So they're much harder to kill. Because if you just turn on the fat-burning mode, they know how to either use glutaminolysis for fuel or other means that are not efficient but don't kill them, okay? So those are drug-resistant, radiation-resistant. You just irradiate them, what do? They'll grow, because that's how they survive, okay? Anyway, we put on some cannabis oil, and right away he had a response. And by now he was in another oncologist, actually a person who was open-minded, and even though he hid behind things, was at least knowing what was going on and was supporting it. And once he saw that, he says, we have nothing in our medical armament that can do anything like this. Put it all over his head. So we put it all over his head, and it ate the cancer right down to the bone. All right? And poor Ted, we used to call him Ted the Head, he winds up going to the hospital for something else. He gets a nosocomial infection, and they give him an antibiotic that he was allergic to, and he dies. His head was open like that for a year without infection. And he took virtually no narcotics after he got on enough oil, because obviously we didn't just put it on his head anymore. Eat this stuff, So this involves another activity that I think I should bring up, so that people understand what's going on. I call it crimes for humanity. Why should we have to commit crimes to save another person's life? This is insane. So what's happening around the world are groups like we have here of activists who are taking matters into their own hands and helping other people. And the word spreads, because once you're cured, or your family's cured, or your friends are cured, you tell others. And they see the difference between using something that restores health rather than something that brings you to the edge of death, and hopefully you live and we kill the cancer. What I've described to you is applicable in so many places. And I've always seen it work. And it's consistent with so much science. On my computer there, I've got 25,000 articles. 13,000 are from cannabis, and the other 13,000 support the stuff that I've told you. I don't make it up. I want somebody to enter in a dialogue with me, show me where I'm wrong, but at least have a conversation. When this addresses so many things, there's all these controversies. Oh, this causes autophagy, this causes apoptosis. It's just nonsense what's going on. We live in a world of fake news, fake science, fake medicine. Cannabis is real medicine. I'll shut up. Thank you for your attention.